All right, so now welcome everyone again. My name is Chris and I'm joined this afternoon by Natalia and Chloe. Hey everybody, how are you?
Doing great.
Yeah, well, we're very excited for this program and we're very excited for our summer reading. As you can see on the screen, the theme is Tales and Tales, and you can learn all about what we have going on this summer. It's still going. We got lots of programs, reading challenges, prizes, book lists, activities. There's a lot there, and you can learn all about it at our landing page, hcplc.org/summer. And also while you're there, you can check out our reading challenges. We have 3 of them this year. As usual, every year we do 3 of them. 1 for adults, 1 for tweens and teens, and 1 for kids. You can log your reading, you can complete activities and be eligible for prizes, so check that out. And also, welcome again. We are excited for our program, Animals in Orbit. So if you came for that program, you're in the right place, and we're going to get started very shortly. Just have a few more things to share. This event was funded by the Tampa-Hillsborough County Children's Library Foundation, so we give them a big thank you. Without their help, we wouldn't be able to do things like this, so we're very, very grateful. Now I'm going to hand things over to Chloe.
All right, so we also have a book shout out for today's program. Today is Laika the Space Dog. This is by Jeni Wittrock, and if you would like to check out this book, you can find it in our Libby app by Overdrive, available as an ebook. And I feel like this is a perfect book for our Animals in Orbit program today.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to give our guest presenter, Natalia, who we're very, very happy to have with us this afternoon. I'm going to give her screen control so she can get going with her program.
So hi, my name is Natalia Guerrero. I work as an astronomer at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Normally I study exoplanets, or planets around other stars, but today I wanted to talk about a really fun, exciting topic, which is animals in orbit. So here I have like a fun little video. This is not actually a dog that's in space, but it shows a real part of the International Space Station where a lot of animals have traveled to space over the last 20 years. So if this is so I really love this video because it sort of grabs your attention and tells you about what things are like in what a space dog might do, although this dog didn't actually go to space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a few stories of animals that have gone to space and why that's important for humans going to outer space. So here is a picture of astronaut Thomas Pesquet from France, who is doing a spacewalk outside of the International Space Station. Now, this is a really wonderful sort of home for humans, habitat for humans outside of Earth, which is our first home where most of us live. So before humans could travel to space in the early 1960s and late 1950s, we had to understand a lot about how humans could survive in space, because in space there's no air, we can't breathe, it's very cold, so without a big spacesuit, we wouldn't be able to survive. And there's no gravity. Essentially, we're weightless. If you've ever swum in a swimming pool and you notice your hair floating above you and it's really hard to sink down to the bottom, but it's really easy to do somersaults, then you have experienced a little tiny bit of what an astronaut experiences when they're in space. They're weightless. So here's another picture of another astronaut, Jessica Meyer, who is actually a biologist and physiologist, and she has studied animals in extreme environments like penguins, deep underwater where there's very little oxygen, and she also studies human physiology, or the human body, and how it behaves in space. So scientists are really interested in understanding the effects that not having a lot of gravity or being weightless has on the human body, and all sorts of experiments like that. But there's very few humans who have been able to travel to the International Space Station and into space in general. So how do we study the different parts of the body without sending a lot of humans and studying their bodies? in great detail. We use animals. Animals have helped us understand how humans survive in space for many years. So first I will talk about Laika. So Laika, which in Russian means barker, was the first animal in space back in 1957. Laika was a stray dog rescued off the street, and the Russian scientists chose her because they said she's even-tempered, she's a very sweet dog, and we think that she'll be able to handle being inside a very tiny capsule launched at 3 times the force, feeling 3 times the force that we feel on the surface of the Earth, that she'll be able to hold up to that. And so that was what Laika did, was they put her in this capsule and sent her to space. And the story of the various dogs that were used on Russian spacecraft, I think a lot of them are really funny. A few of the dogs ran away and they eventually made their way back before going into space. So there's a lot of stories in the early 1960s, late 1950s. A couple of other dogs that went to space were these two, Belka and Strelka. These were also 2 strays that were resilient and were able to travel to space, and they were the first animals to orbit the Earth. They actually spent over a day orbiting the Earth, and what they ended up showing was that animals could survive on orbit. And this was before Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man to go to space, went, and so they demonstrated that yes, humans can survive and animals can survive being in space. And their names actually mean squirrel and arrow. A bunch of other animals went into space with them on this mission. They came along with rabbits and mice, rats, flies, even a few plants and fungi. Another funny side story about Belka in particular, or about Strelka in particular, is that when she had puppies, one of the puppies was given to the daughter of President John F. Kennedy, and that dog was named Pushinka, which in Russian means fluffy. And when Pushinka had puppies, the president of JFK nicknamed them the pupniks, or the little puppies. So what Belka and Strelka and the other dogs that went into orbit demonstrated was how blood pressure, heart rate, brain activity, diet changes when you go to space. Another interesting legacy of early spaceflight was using monkeys and apes. So Miss Baker is one of the most famous of these. She was a squirrel monkey, originally from Peru, who was launched on a rocket. Here she is posing on a mini version of the rocket that she traveled on. And she made a 15-minute flight into suborbital space. And so she was the first US animal to go into space. She also traveled with a companion, a rhesus monkey. I think it's interesting. She also is the inspiration for a character of a TV show that was on Disney Channel a few years ago, Miles from Tomorrowland. So this little monkey character here is named after her. Ham was another chimpanzee who went into space. This was in 1961, and this was to test the Mercury capsule before it launched. Let's see. All right, so now we're moving on into the 80s and 90s to Kentucky, who traveled to space as an egg. This was proposed by a middle school student at the time, John Bellinger, who was a student in Indiana. And he eventually became a college student at Purdue, but he sent a big set of fertilized eggs into space to see how they would do in 0 gravity. And so hens on Earth turn their eggs to counteract gravity. And so he wanted to see what would happen if you sent eggs to space. So Russian scientists in the 1970s had sent quail eggs to space, but they didn't they had a hard time flying and orienting themselves. So when the eggs came back to Earth from this mission, Kentucky was one of the chickens that hatched. And I think one of the funny parts of this story is that to get funding and engineering support, this mission was actually sponsored by KFC. So they referred to the mission as Chicks in Space. I thought one of, if you're more interested in insects, and I really like bugs, there's several stories of insects who went to space. So the first were Anita and Arabella, which were two cross spiders. Now, this experiment was proposed by another student. So if you're interested in science, a lot of interesting science questions come when you're really young and in high school. So this is Judy Miles, who was a student in the 1970s, who was a high schooler, and she proposed, what would happen if you sent a spider to space? How would its web change? And so this was sent on the Skylab 3, which was a precursor to the International Space Station. And the astronauts on that mission noticed that the spiders were kind of swimming around. They at first would build tiny webs and then bigger webs, and they were able to figure out what to do. They also noticed that the spider silk changed in thickness as they spun it, which was different from how spider silk is spun on Earth. There have been more spiders on the ISS in recent years. In 2011, two spiders named Gladys and Esmeralda went to the ISS, and they were named by the astronaut supervising them, Katie Coleman, and they were studied to understand how they would orient themselves in zero gravity. And it turns out they're able to successfully build nets, they were able to hunt, and do all of the things that they also do on Earth with a little bit of an adjustment period, just like humans. And this was also an exciting experiment because students here on Earth could participate by having their own golden orb web spiders in their classroom in a habitat and compare them to the behavior of Gladys and Esmeralda on the ISS. So another interesting group of animals that have gone to space are mice. So mice are really interesting to study because they're mammals like us. Spiders are insects, so they're a little bit different, but mice have a lot of the same biology as we do. They have hearts and spinal cord, nervous system, brains and so we use mice for science here on Earth to test new medicines and things like that. But it's also really useful to study mice for understanding how day and night affect our rhythms of our brains, how our muscle mass changes, how bone loss happens in space, because those things do happen, we've learned from astronauts. So one of the interesting things from mice on the ISS that they noticed was, I'll play this video again, mice that grew up in space were a lot more likely to be physically active, and you can see they're running in these circles around their enclosure. And that was something that the astronauts noticed wasn't typical of mice on Earth. And so this was back in 2019 in a capsule created for them by NASA Ames. So they would race each other around their cages. This is honestly my favorite. One of my favorite creatures, because this is the oyster toadfish, and this is a really shy, reclusive fish that lives mostly in New England, and it was launched on the ISS in 1998 as part of a big suite of experiments on biology called NeuroLab. And the oyster toadfish, as you can tell, has a really big flat head. And inside of its head, it has what's called a vestibular system that's very similar to the human inner ear. So our ears help us balance. If you've ever spun yourself around a bunch of times in a circle, everything seems like it's sort of turning even after you stop. And that's because of your vestibular system or your inner ear. You have little crystals inside of your ear, and the way that they're oriented tells you whether you're standing up or swimming or on your back. And so the anatomy of the system inside of a toadfish's head is very similar to ours. And so we can study and learn a lot about our own balance and inner ear from studying the oyster toadfish. I also think that even though it's kind of weird looking, I think it's really cute. So we also studied the vestibular system and balance using fish and snails. So if you think about it, because astronauts have to spend a few days after they get into orbit adjusting to being weightless and adjusting to not knowing which way is up or down. So this is a critical part of the human body to understand really well. Another example is bobtail squid. So this is a relatively new experiment. This actually launched back in May. This is one of the latest experiments to make its way up to the International Space Station. So those bobtail squid are up there right now. So these are baby squid. They're only a few, I would say like 1/8 of an inch in size. They're very small because they're babies. And these squid glow in the dark. And this isn't just because of something intrinsic to them. This is because that they have help from a bacterium called Vibrio fischeri. And Vibrio fischeri is the name of this bacteria, and it comes together into the squid's body and helps it glow. And this is something called its microbiome, or like its little biome. And so we actually have a microbiome too. In our intestine, we have all of this bacteria that helps us digest food and controls our health. But scientists actually don't know a whole lot about how that works, how these bacteria, which are their own living things, how they help us in our own bodies. So a few scientists, including a graduate student at the University of Florida, she said, okay, or a student who is now a professor at the University of Florida, she said, I want to understand better how the microbiome interacts in space. And so she sent these squid up last month, and they are and the astronauts up there are testing how they interact with the tiny bacteria that help them out with interesting things like glowing in the dark. So I mentioned before that space is a very inhospitable place. There's all sorts of temperature changes. The surface of the moon, humans can't just walk around on, for example. And there's all of this energy coming from the sun. And here on Earth, we have a big magnetic field. So a shield protecting us from all of the energy coming from the sun, radiation. But in space, there's no protection from that. So there's all of this radiation entering everything that's floating through space. It can get very hot, very cold. And so scientists have discovered a specific type of creature, this little guy called a tardigrade. It has other names that I think are even cuter. Tardigrade actually was the Italian for slow stepper, because when scientists first looked through a microscope back in the 1600s and discovered these for the first time, they said, wow, they move really slowly. And so they called it the slow stepper. But German scientists found them around the same time, and in German, the scientists said, oh, this looks like a little bear, and it's in water, so I will name it the water bear. But I think the funniest name for them is moss piglet, and this one on its little piece of moss definitely looks like a little piglet. And tardigrades are amazing little creatures. They can live up to 60 years. And 30 of those years, they can live without food and water. They just dry up and wait until they come in contact with water again. And then they come back to life, essentially. And the way that they do that is by generating antioxidants. And you may have heard of those when people are talking about preventing cancer, or about like drinking green tea or eating blueberries. Oh, these have lots of antioxidants. Well, tardigrades can make lots of them before they go into dormancy. They can also survive really extreme changes in temperature. They can survive almost in an oven, up to like 300 degrees Fahrenheit, or down to freezing temperatures, down to -400 degrees Fahrenheit. So they can survive all of these temperatures. So they've actually been demonstrated to survive in space and in the deep ocean. They can survive huge amounts of radiation. And so recently tardigrades were brought to the International Space Station back in June. They're up there right now, and scientists are conducting all sorts of experiments, changing their habitat to see how they change, because by studying their DNA, their levels of antioxidants, we can better understand how human biology can behave in space. So I actually think this is really exciting because the ISS has a news page, and they said that this week they're starting the tardigrade experiments up there. So this is happening right now. This is live science. So hopefully this opens your eyes to the history of animals in space. Animals at first were sent to space before humans to help us understand how humans can survive in space. And they often did little tasks and helped us understand what was going to happen when we were going into this unknown environment. And now animals help us understand the details of human biology in space, because a lot of laws went into place to protect animals and make sure that their welfare was prioritized in space. We are able to do we're not sending big animals like dogs or cats up to space anymore, but with small animals, we're able to still understand a whole lot about our cells, our microbiome, and better understand how we can live in space for many, many years. So if you want to learn more about what's going on at the International Space Station, NASA has a YouTube channel called Space to Ground, where every week they make YouTube videos about everything that happened on the International Space Station that week. So I imagine if you tune in next week, they will have a little bit of a feature on what the tardigrades have been doing. And they also have a Twitter account. So I am really excited to dive into this, and to, as a person who studies the stars and studies planets around other stars, I'm really interested also in what's happening close to Earth, how we can get humans into space and better understand what we're doing in space. So I will pause there, and we can go over to any questions.
Alrighty, so it looks like we do have a couple of questions that have been shared. If anybody has any questions that they do want to ask, make sure you use the little question section on the side of your screen. Let's see. The first question we have is, what happened to Laika after she was in space?
So Laika unfortunately did not survive the trip, and the scientists knew that there was a possibility of this happening. And afterwards, there was a big question of, was it worth it? So there's a lot of ethical questions that go into studying how and why we send animals to space.
Okay. How do the insects survive the high pressure? Aren't their bodies more fragile than ours?
That's a good question. Yeah, because it's really easy to squish a bug, right? But when you think about it, bugs have, and insects have what's called an exoskeleton. So their skeleton, our skeleton is inside our body, but their skeleton is outside their body. And if you've ever noticed like an ant fall from like a table down to the ground, they survive. They get up and they don't, it doesn't matter. But if one of us were to fall off of like a skyscraper, we would not survive. So tiny insects are able to survive lots of like high impact falls and things, but that is one of the considerations you have to take into account. But fortunately, the launch of a spacecraft from the Earth, you only ever really experience 3 times the pressure of like the air that you would experience here on Earth. So most organisms, most living organisms can survive that just fine.
We have a couple of questions about different types of animals that have been sent to space. Somebody wants to know if any type of bird has ever been sent into space.
Yes, so I mentioned that these chicken eggs had been sent to space and then brought back and then hatched on Earth. But in the 1970s, there was a Russian experiment to send quail eggs to space and try and hatch them in space. And unfortunately, some of the quail eggs, for whatever reason, didn't hatch into quail, but some did. And so there were baby quail flying around trying to orient themselves in the space environment.
Let's see here. Somebody's asking, is there any place where a tardigrade cannot survive?
I think if they get up to above a certain temperature, like around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, so if you were to turn up the oven to 350, they may not survive. So that's one of the interesting questions is where don't they survive? And of course, if you like make the radiation levels too high or too cold, then yeah, they won't make it.
Okay. I think I only have like one or two more questions in here. Let's see. Someone wants to know how do the humans and the animals survive when they're blasted into space?
Right. So for humans, what ends up happening is you're experiencing what it would be like if you weighed suddenly 3 times as much as you do. So what that does is it pushes on your body, and our body is mostly made out of water. And so it moves around a lot of the fluids in our body. So if you're an astronaut, what they'll do is they'll lay them on their backs. That's why you see in all of the movies that astronauts are like lying back like this, because your body can survive pressure a lot better on your chest than if it's pushing down on your head or pushing up on your feet. So they lie the astronauts back, and they often put them in these compression suits. If you've ever like tried on a pair of really tight socks or a pair of compression socks, what it does is it squeezes all of the blood and keeps it like compresses your leg and like moves more of your blood up to like your chest and torso. So essentially what these G suits or compression suits are doing the same thing. They're keeping more of the astronauts' blood like close to their brain and their heart, which are the important places where you need lots of blood. So that's often how they'll help astronauts survive. And when they launched monkeys, they did similar things. They gave them harnesses, made sure they had lots of padding. And then the geometry of other smaller animals is a little bit different, so they don't need as much of that, but I also don't know. I'd be really interested to find out though, like, do mice get their own little harnesses? That would be so cute.
Okay, and this is a really interesting question, is did Strelka's puppies have any ill effects from her being in space?
It's from the research I read, it sounded like they were all just fine. But that's a really good question, and that's actually a science question. A lot of experiments try to study different animals at different parts of their lives and then what their descendants do. And so sometimes they'll send up, like this chicken experiment, they'll send up eggs and then send them back and say, okay, did these chickens come out affected? Did any of their offspring come out affected? And sometimes they, like for example, the quail eggs, they found that some of the quails did have effects, but they're not sure if that was radiation or if that was just something to do with the launch. So but that is like that sort of genetic research is definitely something that scientists are interested in pursuing. So I like your thinking. You're thinking like a scientist.
All right, it looks like we have time for one more question. Let's see here. So I know we talked about a lot of different reptiles and different types of animals, but somebody wants to know if other reptiles such as snakes or even frogs have been up in space.
I don't know about snakes, but tadpoles have definitely been sent to space, as have frogs.
All right.
All right. Hello again. Well, that was a great presentation, great questions. Thank you so much, Natalia and Chloe, for leading the Q&A. Lots of great information. I love that dog video. I could watch that for hours. That was so cute, so funny. As most dog videos are, cute and fun, right? All right. Well, if you want to contact the library, you can call the number here on your screen, 813-273-3652, or you can go online at our website at hcplc.org/contact. Also on our website, you can learn about our upcoming events and our summer reading landing page, hcplc.org/summer. And you can also submit your library stories. Share your experiences with the library. We want to hear them at hcplc.org/stories. All right, I'm going to stop saying hcplc.org, and I'm going to thank Natalia and Chloe for this great program. I'm going to thank everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Bye. Bye, Natalia. Bye, Chloe.